Bedford QL. This one was involved in D-Day and went across to Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, along with other vehicles like the two carriers either side. It was one of the largest ground assaults in history and still remains so. None of it would have been possible without the RAF and the Allied Air Forces. Without Bomber Command, it wouldn't have been possible, including 5-1 Squadron flying from RAF Snaith. I'll hand you over to Tony, who will tell you the story of the squadron and the vital part it played in liberating Europe.
The bombers also managed to put out 20 radar stations, which meant that the large parts of the English Channel weren't actually able to be covered by the Germans. And completely removed radar from large parts of it. They had a number of diversionary tactics as well. The region around Calais was bombed heavily and intensely to confuse the Nazi authorities, thinking that there was the invasion was going to be planned for Calais. That actually worked pretty well, because even days after, Hitler was convinced that it was a mere diversion to the main invasion, and he withheld the troops defending Calais until it was far too late. So the majority of troops were stationed around there, trying to protect that area, when of course we have no intentions of landing around Calais. Other bombers also flew diversionary operations. Two squadrons flew low over the Channel, dropping things what was called windows, which were strips of metal. And those were there to create the illusion, if you like, of a large armada of ships. They showed up on the German radar that they did have as effectively ships crossing the Channel. The heavy bombers also in service, the American Flying Fortresses, when they were born, equipped with radar in there, which was able to jam German radio frequencies, making them not only blind from radar but also deaf. Another diversionary tactics was round Paratrooper Rupert. It was Paratrooper Rupert, who was a sackcloth filled with sand and straw. In the shape of a dummy parachutist, but they dropped 450 of these on the night of the invasion. So the Germans thought they were being attacked from the air. But they were also designed to produce gunfire sounds and fire flares to add even further confusion to the German forces. So there was quite a lot of diversionary tactics went off. Photo reconnaissance part of the RAF were extremely important as well, mapping out German positions and lines of communication. Medium bombers followed up attack aircraft to take out gun positions prior to D-Day, but they also were there to destroy vital road bridges crossing the Seine, again to prevent reinforcements by the German forces. By dawn of the 6th of June, the meteorological flights had already taken place, so the RAF were already in place actually before D-Day took place, making the weather was suitable enough for the invasion to take place. Over that day, Bomber Command sent over 1,000 bombers out. Imagine seeing 1,000 bombers in the air at any one time, dropping over 5,000 tons of bombs on gun emplacements. RAF Transport Command were also very busy. They were delivering troops via Halifax bombers towing in gliders. Normally, Halifax bomber would tow as many as 3 gliders at one time. I'm not sure I'd like to have been in the back of one of those being towed by a heavy bomber. It must have been a pretty bumpy ride, I would imagine. And they also obviously dropped paratroopers as well as the Ruperts. to seize vital bridges and roads, again to prevent the German forces reinforcing themselves. Coastal Command, again another important part of the Royal Air Force, protected the fleet from German speedboats and submarines. They patrolled the approaches to the beaches day and night. Short Sunderland and Consolidated Liberators were long-range aircraft equipped with radar, and they were excellent at spotting German submarines, but nothing came close to the Beaufighter. And to the teeth with rockets, bombs and torpedoes in taking out those German submarine threats, which weren't exactly very large in number, because they weren't able to do so. Closer to the landings, fighters were there to provide protection for the landing, and as a result the superiority of the RAF in this area resulted in only 2 enemy aircraft in attacking the beaches on D-Day itself. So they did an amazing job in keeping the German Air Force at bay. Transport Command, again another important part of the Royal Air Force, brought more troops and supplies into the area quickly, but also were also instrumental in taking the wounded from the beaches back to the UK as well, to the hospitals. Bombers were pulverising the transport links and German transport, so they were doing a huge job there. Again, huge fleets of bombers were sent over, mainly again Halifax bombers, including those from 51 Squadron, which we'll come to shortly. Fighters were providing close to support with rockets and attacking tanks, again using Hawker Typhoons, which were very deadly weapons, scaring the German troops to death, to the extent that if they saw a typhoon in the area, they'd run from the tanks, knowing that they wouldn't stand a chance against the rockets that they were able to carry. And by 9th of June, RAF fighters were already flying from French bases just 3 days after D-Day. Observation aircraft such as the Oster were able to direct artillery fire to the German lines, again with such accuracy that they were made to cease fire to prevent fire coming upon them from the British and Allied forces. From the middle of June, 2 TAF continued to attack German positions and armoured vehicles using Hawker Typhoons that destroyed large amounts of the German tank brigades. And as I mentioned earlier, the Typhoons were enough to make the crews abandon the tanks and strong points. They continued to attack German positions with rockets. Carry on for the last one. Further into the battle for Normandy now, on the 7th of July, Operation Charnwood again saw a further 450 heavy bombers bombing the outskirts of Caen, where the British and Allied forces had been bogged down by quite a strong German resistance to them, and they needed the heavy bombers to break through the German lines, and this is what Operation Charnwood was, and again it was followed on the 18th by a similar operation which was successful, then allowing mainly the British, Polish and Canadian forces to move forward quicker. Unfortunately, during that period there was a particular battle which went on in the Falaise Gap, as it's called, which I'll come to in a minute, that did unfortunately lead to tragedy. There was a breakdown in coordination between the Royal Air Force and the Canadian forces on the ground. Unfortunately, they were using the same colour flares. The RAF were using, the Pathfinders were using them as target markers, whereas the Canadian forces were actually using them to show where their troops were, which meant that the RAF then bombed the emplacements of where the Canadian forces were, and that unfortunately led to 65 British and Canadian soldiers with over 300 wounded as well. So it was a pretty nasty friendly fire that took place, which unfortunately happens, doesn't it, in war. During these months over the Battle of Normandy, They averaged 5,000 sorties a week. This is just how important the RAF partaking in the Battle of Normandy was. Without them, they wouldn't have been able to advance, take out the German panzer divisions and move forward to liberate France. By late July, Germans started using V1 bombers, but in Operation Crossbow, they were sought out by our again, heavy bombers, which were destroying the V1 bombs and their launch sites as well. But it also saw the widespread use of the first jet aircraft flown by the Royal Air Force, the Gloucester Meteor. Ironically, I always find this quite ironic, is that who was the guy who invented the jet engine? Sir Frank Whittle, yes. And what nationality was he? No, he was British. Yeah. But ironically, who had the first fighter jet aircraft? The Germans. Yes, Messerschmitt Me-262 were the first jet aircraft, followed by the Gloucester Meteor, and that was all done by a wonderful government who really didn't believe in Mr. Whittle's idea of a jet engine. And the Germans were quick to develop it and brought out the first fighter jet that could actually fly 150 miles an hour faster than the Meteor, and was the first engine with a swept wing. But they never actually met in combat, fortunately. So we don't know exactly which one would have won that battle. By 25th of August, Paris was liberated, and within weeks so was the whole of France. So D-Day, despite its cost of many, was a huge success and certainly freed France at that particular time. But as I've already said, RAF played a huge and critical role in the battle for Normandy. Over that period, flew 225,000 sorties. But however, they did lose 2,000 aircraft with a loss of over 8,000 crewmen, which was huge losses to them, very, very large losses into the RAF at that time. But they did sweep the skies of the Luftwaffe, that hammered the enemy on the ground and devastated German transport and communications, and finally cleared the way for Allies to begin the advance that would free Europe. Did mention one particular attack, which was the Valais Gap, and this is where they'd broken through the defences in Calais and were forcing the German forces back across France, and they created like this pincer movement, again Americans, Canadian, Polish and British forces, effectively surrounding them and almost corralling them through this very narrow gap where the bombers and fighters were able to attack and almost destroy the armies that were there. Huge casualties, quite large casualties on the Allied side, but unfortunately it was a bit of a turkey shoot, and a huge amount of German lives were lost. Quite a lot of controversy over that particular exercise, because it really was something that, they were literally corralled into this very small area where they were able to be taken out in very large numbers. So during the period running up to D-Day, on the 5th of June, both ground crew and air crew knew something was in the wind, because they was doing certain preparations to aircraft, for example, putting in different type of radar. And at the briefing, even on the morning of the 6th, crews were told a target, but not the reason for their operation. So they were still flying over, just thinking this was a normal bombing operation to take out German fortifications, etc. 24 aircraft from 51 Squadron based here were detailed for this operation, carrying 9 1,000-pound bombs and a further 500-pound high explosives. So 24 operational aircraft took off from RAF Snaith. And on the morning, 51 Squadron were given the target number T10J178, attacking a heavy battery at Montfleury, overlooking Gold Beach. This was quite an important target to be taken out, because it was very heavily fortified and very strongly built, and would have been a huge distraction and caused probably a much larger loss of life had it not have been taken out by 51 Squadron on that day. This has stopped working. Oh no, it hasn't. They took off 2:28 a.m. to get up pretty early that day. Probably didn't even bother going to bed, I wouldn't have thought. The briefings would have probably taken place around midnight, one would guess. So they took off between 2:28 and 2:58, achieving the target area at 04:37 and 04:42. There was heavy cloud cover on the day, but that didn't prevent the bombers hitting their targets. There were no real opposition from the Germans, but on their return across the channel they could now see the armada of ships coming across, so they knew that something unusual was happening, shall we say. Even by that time they still didn't know that this was the full invasion. 22 of the aircraft landed safely back at base. One of them had gone US on takeoff, so that one didn't go, but one did arrive back, but to a different airbase due to a fuel shortage. The crews actually heard the news on the BBC on return back to base, which was being broadcast over the tannoy when a loud cheer was heard. This is, just thought to put this in as well, actually is a logbook of one of the crews of 51 Squadron. If you can see, I don't know if you can actually see it, Pilot Officer Wastel, I'm not exactly sure how it was pronounced, but he was a rear gunner. And as you see there, almost in the middle there, Montfleury D-Day, where they hit the target at 4:45 on the day. And on the right here, or your left, my right, is the damage done to that particular fortification. Which was devastating for the Germans. Further examination showed that they were built incredibly strongly and very well fortified, but bombing was so successful that it damaged their ammunition store, which meant when it was looked at afterwards and captured the bunkers, they found that the gun crews there had already run out of ammunition and weren't able to fire upon the landing troops, which again saved huge amounts of lives as a result. So 51 Squadron played a huge part in saving large numbers of life by taking out that gun battery. Bomber Command were also really important in supporting operations on the ground by continuing to bomb gun emplacements. Further to that, 51 Squadron provided a further 23 aircraft on the 30th of June to protect British and American armies from two panzer divisions which were fighting back around the Caen area, which the British and Americans were trying to break through. Because of the smoke and the amount of dust that was around at the time, Master Bomber ordered bombers down to just 4,000 feet for accuracy. Imagine flying a heavy bomber like a Halifax at 4,000 feet through heavy dust and cloud area. Over 1,000 tons of bombs were dropped, which also allowed the advancement of the troops. Further to that, again, a further operation, Operation Goodwood, took place 2 weeks after D-Day to again help the troops break through the determined and strong German lines of tanks and troops, trying to prevent them from doing so. The British troops had been pinned down by Germans and they needed to break out. So an attack was planned to break through these lines, and again that came down to the one that I mentioned before, the Falaise Gap. Break of dawn, before the attack, 51 Squadron again joined one of the strongest armadas in history to tear apart targets. They bombed between 5 and 10,000 feet, dropping a total of 5,000 tons of 500 and 1,000 pound heavy explosive bombs. By mid-August, they planned to break out of there, forcing the Germans through this Falaise Gap, and where they were able to destroy a large number of their panzers and troops and other transport. On the 9th, the 7th, the 8th of August, 22 aircraft from 51 Squadron were also involved in Operation Totalize. Squadron joined 1,000 bombers and dropped 3,500 tons of bombs on the retreating army. Again, this was at the Falaise Gap, so it was like pretty much of a turkey shoot, but with 1,000 bombers taking part, the Germans didn't really stand a chance. Allied columns were therefore able to now push forward quickly and relieve France as a result. 14th of August was the next operation. The 51 Squadron joined Bomber Command in Operation Tractable, bombing German positions which again were holding up Canadian and American advances. Again sweeping low over the German enemy defences. Again creating a huge dust cloud which allowed Allies to break through the German tanks. Basically the German tank divisions, the panzer divisions, were completely blinded by the dust that the aircraft had effectively created, and therefore our tanks were able to break through their lines with very little opposition because they just didn't see them coming. However, during that time, as described earlier, there was the friendly fire incident that I mentioned during that particular Operation Tractable. So it was a bittersweet victory. Between 43 and 45, 166 aircraft were lost here from RAF Snaith and from 51 Squadron, a very large number, and also 687 crew members lost their lives. Quite devastating for just one squadron to lose that many of its crews. Prior to that, 150 Squadron had also lost 205 members of its crew while flying Wellington bombers. Nevertheless, 51 Squadron played a critical role in the success of D-Day and the liberation of Europe in its many interventions during the operations at that time, and were instrumental in keeping the Allied forces moving forward. So finally, just thought to show you one or two pictures from RAF Snaith at the time. This one's one of the Halifaxers that was lucky to make it back because it actually got hit by a Lancaster. Tearing through the tailplane and the rear section of the Halifax, as you can see the damage there. I'm not sure I'd like to have been in a rear gunner position in that situation with a Lancaster that up close and personal. But I mean, it really was probably the worst place on the aircraft to be in the rear gunner position. I've known stories of people telling me that that 15-year-old lads who'd falsified the papers acting as rear gunners, which you just can't imagine that happening today, could you? Particularly when you think of the conditions that they had to fly in. The average temperature sitting in the back turret there was in the region of -45 degrees. I liken it to, often said to the kids, if you've got a freezer at home, and how would you fancy sitting in it with the door shut for 8 hours? Because that's what it would be like. In fact, it would be 3 times colder than your freezer. And of course, it was also the hardest place in the world to get out of in terms of exiting the aircraft, should you need to do so, because there was no room in that very small turret for a parachute. So the turrets were kept at the back, the parachute kept in the back of the aircraft, which meant he had to climb out of his gun position, put his parachute on, climb back in there, turn it round and fall out backwards. Now if your aircraft is in, shall we say, a bit of a crash dive and you're coming from the back and falling, which way are you going to go? Towards the front of the aircraft with its propellers still probably turning. That would have been pretty scary in itself. So really not the nicest place in the aircraft to be. And the average numbers of sorties that a rear gunner did was 3. So pretty scary place. I got this upside down again. That's why I'm doing it wrong. I got it upside down. Nope, it's just stopped working. Why has it stopped working? Oh, we'll do this way. Okay. This is another one again, a 51 Squadron, E, being expensive, E for expensive babe. It's got 25 bomb symbols, so he'd actually done 25 sorties, which was again pretty much unheard of. And then finally at Halifax here, been bombed up with a mixed load of 500-pound bombs and incendiaries waiting for its dispersal. One thing I'd like to do is pay tribute to this man, Squadron Leader Mark Long, who unfortunately lost his life at the weekend whilst displaying in his Spitfire part of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. He was also due to take command of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight this year, and had also been a Typhoon pilot as well as an instructor, and was also involved in, was the lead pilot in the display team last year. So it's with great sorrow that we recognise him, Blue Sky Sir. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and hope you found it useful and enjoyable.
Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next week. Till then, take care of yourselves and each other.